Imagine standing on a busy street, when suddenly, a wall of thick, brown liquid as tall as a building comes roaring towards you at 50 kilometers per hour. Not water, not mud, but sticky, boiling hot molasses. It sounds like a scene from a surreal disaster movie, but on January 15th, 1919, it really happened, right in the heart of Boston. To understand why an entire neighborhood was swallowed by a sugary tsunami, we need to go back to the early 20th century. At that time, molasses, thick, sweet syrup made from sugarcane, wasn't just for baking cookies. It was a vital industrial product used to make rum and, more importantly, to produce ethanol for explosives during World War I. In Boston's North End, the Purity Distilling Company had built a massive steel storage tank, 15 meters high and 27 meters across. It held over 8.7 million liters of molasses, enough to fill more than 3 Olympic swimming pools. Locals complained for years that the tank leaked so badly that children would bring cups to collect the sweet syrup dripping down its sides. The company's response? Paint it brown to hide the leaks. January 15th, 1919 was an unusually warm winter day. The temperature in Boston had jumped from freezing cold to over 10 degrees Celsius in just 24 hours. Inside the tank, the molasses had likely fermented, producing carbon dioxide and increasing the internal pressure. Around 12:30 p.m., workers nearby heard a deep rumble, followed by a sound like machine gun fire as the steel rivets shot out from the tank's seams. Then it happened. The entire tank exploded. A wave of molasses, 8 meters high, burst out with the force of a freight train, tearing through the streets at nearly 50 kilometers per hour. Wooden buildings were flattened, horses were thrown through the air, and people were swept off their feet and trapped in the sticky flood. Witnesses said the ground shook and the air smelled overwhelmingly sweet. And yet, the scene was pure chaos and terror. Firefighter George Lay, who was stationed nearby, later said, "It was like a wave of dark syrup, moving fast, swallowing everything." The wave smashed through homes, factories, and the elevated train tracks. One train was literally lifted off its tracks. For those caught in the flood, molasses was far more dangerous than water. It was dense, about 40% thicker than oil, and clung to everything it touched. People couldn't swim in it. Horses suffocated where they stood. Some victims were trapped against walls or under debris, slowly sinking into the syrup until they could no longer breathe. In just minutes, Boston's North End looked like a battlefield covered in sticky, brown mud. Rescue workers described the scene as eerily quiet, except for the cries of the trapped. Rescue efforts began almost immediately, but the molasses made everything far more difficult than anyone imagined. Firefighters, police officers, and soldiers rushed to the scene, some still in their lunch breaks, only to find the streets transformed into a dark, sticky swamp. The syrup was waist-deep in places, and so dense that every step felt like wading through cement. Boots were sucked off feet, and rescuers sometimes had to pull each other out by the arms. The first cries for help came from people trapped under collapsed buildings. Rescuers used planks of wood to distribute their weight, slowly making their way over the thick, shimmering surface. One team found a group of children pinned against a fence, barely able to keep their heads above the syrup. They cut them free using axes and saws, but even then, pulling them out was like dragging them from quicksand. In one harrowing account, a firefighter spotted a man waving from a second-story window, trapped by molasses flooding the ground floor. They formed a human chain, climbing the building from the outside, and pulled him out through the roof. The rescue lasted well into the night, with lanterns and torches casting flickering light over a street that looked like it had been hit by a slow-motion tidal wave. Even hours later, some survivors were still found alive under debris, encased in molasses that had begun to harden as the winter air returned. It took over 4 days before the last missing person was recovered, and by then, the once bustling neighborhood of the North End had been reduced to a silent, sticky graveyard. In the aftermath, questions swirled. How could such a disaster happen in the middle of a major city? The investigation revealed shocking negligence. The steel tank had been poorly built, with walls too thin to hold its massive load. It had never been tested for structural integrity. The company had ignored complaints and visible leaks for years. Survivors sued the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which owned Purity Distilling. In what became one of the first major class action lawsuits in Massachusetts, the company was found liable and ordered to pay over $600,000 in damages, equivalent to about $10 million today. But for Boston, the damage was not just financial. The North End remained coated in molasses for weeks. Streets, basements, and even the harbor were stained brown. It's said that on hot summer days, the smell of molasses lingered in the area for decades. The Boston molasses disaster didn't just change the skyline of the North End, it changed how America thought about safety. In the months after the flood, cleanup crews worked tirelessly, scraping hardened molasses from streets, walls, and even the inside of homes. The syrup had seeped into cellars, stuck between cobblestones, and coated everything it touched. The harbor water was stained brown for months. Sailors reported that their ships' hulls remained sticky long after leaving Boston. The smell became legendary. For decades, North End residents swore that on hot summer days, the scent of molasses would rise from the ground. Even 40 years later, old-timers claimed they could still smell it after a rainstorm. From a legal standpoint, the disaster was a turning point. It led to stricter municipal and state building codes, mandatory inspections, and engineering certifications for all large structures, not just in Massachusetts, but across the country. It also marked one of the earliest examples of a successful class action lawsuit in the United States, setting a precedent for holding corporations accountable for negligence. And in a strange way, the event became part of Boston's identity. Newspapers occasionally revisited the story, sometimes in a darkly humorous tone, sometimes as a cautionary tale. Today, the site of the disaster is marked with a small plaque, an unassuming reminder of the day when a quiet neighborhood was swallowed by a wave of sweetness that turned deadly. And so, one warm winter day in 1919, Boston learned a lesson the hard way, that even something sweet can turn deadly in an instant. The day the city drowned, not in water, but in molasses. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more strange and fascinating moments from history, don't forget to subscribe to Think Twist. We bring you the kind of tales you won't find in your school textbooks. Stories that make you say, "Wait, that really happened?" Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next twist of history.